During the company couples party, my wife asked if she could dance a tango with her boss, but my answer left everyone frozen. Yes, but after that, we'll go back alone to different houses. I saw her smile fade as eyes turned to us. I left before the music started, my dignity still intact and my heart in ruins. This should have been just another night like any other, but in that room, with warm lights and fake laughter echoing through the room, something inside me broke forever. It was there, right there, in front of everyone, and worse, in front of herself, that my absence began to weigh more heavily than my presence. Because deep down, she no longer saw me. She was so consumed with being desired by other eyes that she forgot who looked at her every day as if she were the only woman in the world. And in that moment, I understood. I was just the company that filled her days, but no longer the man she wanted at night. She wanted to dance with him. It wasn't just a dance. It was permission. It was a rehearsal for the freedom she wanted to experience away from me. And maybe she thought I wouldn't notice. That I would let it pass, like so many other times I'd closed my eyes to small signs, small absences, small, weightless lies. But I did. And in that moment, my body froze before the tango began. My soul had been dancing alone for a long time, I just didn't want to admit it. And when I said those words, I felt all eyes on me, but none hurt more than hers, not out of hurt, but out of surprise. She never thought I'd have the courage to say that. And neither did I. But there's a limit, even for those who love too much. I left. I left behind the glass of wine, the lump in my throat, and her scent on my coat. I left with my heart pounding inside, but my head held high. And I walked to the car with slow steps, each one heavier than the last, as if my own shadow were asking me why it still hurt so much. I slept alone that night, in an apartment that still had paintings of our smiles. Every corner of that house was a memory, every detail a silent punch. And the following days were no better. She didn't call. She didn't text. She didn't knock. Her absence, so glaring, was the answer I didn't want to hear. She chose silence. And there began the cruelest part of all, she hadn't betrayed me with her body, yet. But she betrayed me with her will, with the desire to be seen by another, with the comfort of knowing I would still be there even if she crossed a line. What she didn't expect was that day, I would push her over that line. Time passed. Slowly, dragged on, as if each hour carried a new weight. And I began rebuilding myself, with pieces of myself I never thought I'd use. I changed the living room furniture. I donated the sheets that smelled like us. I changed bakeries. I changed my route to work. All to avoid remembering. All to forget. But forgetting someone you truly loved isn't a matter of distance. It's a matter of courage. And it was in the midst of this process, dirty, painful, tiring, that she appeared again. Too late. She came with teary eyes, her mouth trembling, and her once steady hands now indecisive. She apologized. She said she'd made a mistake, that she'd gotten confused, that she thought she was being forgotten, when in fact it was she who was forgetting me. She said the boss wanted nothing more than a dance, that he left after the party, that there was never anything more. And maybe that was true. But her truth arrived late. I was no longer the same man. I listened to her. In silence. Because I've learned that sometimes silence hurts more than any scream. And when she finished, she expected me to tell her I loved her. She expected me to open my arms, as I had so many times. But this time, I just smiled. A sad but sincere smile. I told her I forgave her. Not because I wanted her back, but because I needed to free myself from the pain of hating her. I told her I held no grudges, just emptiness. And that this emptiness, now, was being filled by someone who knew the value of a presence. She cried. She cried like I'd never seen her before. But I didn't cry. Because all the tears had already dried on the nights she didn't realize I was by her side, trying to hold on to something she herself had let slip away. We parted there, on a park bench, like two strangers with a shared past. And I returned home with a light heart, not because I was happy, but because I was free. Free from carrying a love that only existed on one side. Days later, by chance, our paths crossed again. A coffee. An ordinary day. Me with her, the new woman who taught me what it means to be loved without having to beg. And my ex, alone, in a corner, with the same lost look she'd had when the music started at that party. She saw us. She smiled weakly. And for the first time, she didn't try to hide her regret. I saw in her face everything she never said, the pain of realizing she'd lost what can't be found twice. And you know what's most ironic? The tango that night never even happened. He danced with someone else. A new employee. Months later, I discovered this by chance. And in that cruel, small detail lay the greatest tragedy of all time. She destroyed a marriage for empty desire. She traded love for an illusion. And discovered, too late, that what she lost was exactly what she'd spent her life searching for. Life has a strange way of teaching us. Sometimes it gives us the right love at the wrong time. Sometimes it puts temptation in front of us just to see who we truly are. And sometimes it takes away what we love most to show us who we were while we were loving. I'm no saint. I made mistakes. I failed. But one thing is certain, I never left her alone. And she, in the end, chose solitude. Today, when I close my eyes, I still remember the last time I heard her voice. Lowered, trembling, apologizing. Not for dancing. But for hesitating. For not choosing. For thinking I would always be there. The love she once had now dances to the rhythm of another heart. And the music she so longed for now plays in an empty room, with her dancing alone. But what really happened after that night? How did life turn us upside down and force us to face everything we avoided for so long? What remains of love after it was broken? The answer lies where it all began, in the silence of the tango that never happened. Welcome to the channel. Here, we've made it clear from the start, we do not romanticize and never support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry profound truths, because they aim to show how infidelity destroys homes, corrodes affections and tears out the roots of what could be eternal. Get ready to dive into a narrative intense, realistic and emotionally devastating. Take a deep breath, the story that comes next will mark you. They met in a simple, almost cliched, yet genuine way. It was late summer, and everything around them seemed to pulse with a hope that only warmer months bring. Noah was leaving a coffee shop with 2 cups in his hands when he accidentally bumped into a woman in a hurry talking on the phone. Coffee spilled on the papers she was carrying, and for a moment, the chaos of the moment paralyzed them both. Apologies, awkward smiles, and an involuntary touch of hands. That was how he met Emily, with spilled coffee, warmth, and a smile he would treasure for years like a mental photograph. From that encounter, something between them began to build naturally. Like someone finding a place to rest after a long journey. Their first encounters were light, filled with long conversations about movies, books, and old songs. Noah, with his reserved and observant manner, saw in Emily a rare, almost restless intensity, as if she were in a hurry to live but at the same time longed to lose herself in meaningful silences. She, enchanted by his calm, felt that she could finally take off her soul's shoes and walk barefoot with someone who truly listened to her. As the months passed, they built a kind of quiet intimacy that needed no grand declarations. It was in the way she leaned against his shoulder during movies, or how he knew exactly when she wanted to be silent and just exist by his side. Life wasn't perfect, of course, but it was honest. They shared small dreams, a house with a balcony, a road trip with no destination, a dog they'd never had the courage to adopt. When they decided to live together, it was more of a consequence than a strategic decision. They were ready. Or at least, they believed they were. The apartment they chose was modest, but it had natural light and a kitchen she loved, even though it was small. On weekends, they cooked together. She danced barefoot around the living room, holding a glass of wine, while he laughed and tried to keep the pots and pans under control. The routine settled in with the serenity of someone who believes they are exactly where they should be. Time was kind to them. There was respect in the gestures, in the small concessions, in the long conversations before bed. Emily worked in the communications department of a growing company. She was dedicated, focused, and took her work very seriously. Noah was a data analyst at a multinational company. He spent his days immersed in numbers, but always made a point of getting home before she fell asleep. On specific nights of the week, they had a ritual of dining out. Whether it was a fancy restaurant or a neighborhood pizzeria, the important thing was being together. Emily loved to talk about the details of her day, and he listened with almost religious attention. She spoke with a sparkle in her eyes about marketing campaigns, team challenges, new projects. Sometimes she seemed exhausted, but she still thrilled with each small professional victory. Noah, even without understanding all the dynamics of that creative universe, admired the passion with which she spoke. It was beautiful to watch her grow. She was intelligent, charismatic, and, above all, ambitious. There was always something to achieve, something to improve, something more. Noah, on the other hand, was more introspective. He thrived on stability, on the certainty of a steady job, bills paid, commitments fulfilled. He wasn't thirsty for the world, but he was thirsty for depth. Emily was the hurricane, he was the shelter. And for a long time, it worked. At gatherings with friends, they were seen as the perfect couple. Those who complemented each other because they were different, yet knew how to listen to each other. Her friends adored Noah, always kind, polite, and present. His friends, however, found Emily fascinating, for her spontaneous, firm, and witty demeanor. There were no constant fights, no unresolved hurts. Sure, there were arguments, as any mature couple faces, but nothing that threatened the foundation of their relationship. On birthdays, they exchanged handwritten letters. On ordinary occasions, they surprised each other with small details, a note left on the mirror, a favorite dessert brought as a surprise, a lingering touch before bed. There was love, affection, and a story built day after day. But time, silent and treacherous, begins to draw invisible cracks in the most solid structures. And no one realizes when it begins. Maybe it's in the first distracted glance, the hurried kiss before leaving for work, the colder text responses. Or maybe it's in overconfidence, in the idea that the other person will always be there, because they always have been. Emily started getting promoted. Her name began to be mentioned more often in meetings, her projects gained visibility. Invitations to company events became more frequent, networking dinners more inevitable. Noah, proud, supported everything, even though, inside, he felt her presence slowly fading through the cracks of time. He began to notice that she arrived later, more tired, and that her mind seemed elsewhere. There were no accusations, no real distrust. Just a vague feeling of being left behind, like holding the hand of someone already 2 steps ahead. One night, returning from one of these corporate events, Emily arrived quieter than usual. She changed her clothes in silence, said she was exhausted, and slept facing the opposite side of the bed. Noah, on the other side, stared at the ceiling. There was no fight. There was no crisis. But there was a silence that said much more than any argument could. He realized, in that instant, that something was changing. And perhaps he had no control over it. Over the days, she began to talk less about work and more about goals, results, and pressure. Noah, always willing to listen, began to feel excluded from that universe. It was as if her world had gained new layers that he could no longer access. Their once warm conversations began to turn into bureaucratic updates. Spontaneous dinners became the exception. And the lingering touches before bed became automatic rituals. Still, he didn't complain. He didn't demand. He didn't question. He believed that difficult times existed and that, as a mature couple, they would overcome them. But inside him, the emptiness began to take shape. A present absence, as if they were living in the same house but leading parallel lives. He tried to rekindle the flame. He suggested trips, outings, reminisced about old stories. Emily smiled, saying they were just going through a rough patch, that everything would calm down. But her eyes didn't lie. She was distant. And the most painful thing was that he still loved her with everything he had. The love didn't diminish. But it began to change shape. From desire to anticipation. From joy to silence. And then came the invitation to the company party. A gala event, complete with a +1, live music, and a fine dinner. Emily hesitated when she told him. She said it would be something formal, without many surprises, but she wanted him to go. Noah, even though he wasn't thrilled, accepted. He knew how important that moment was to her. He put on his best suit, fixed his hair, and decided that night, he would do everything possible to be there. To be seen. To show he was still there. The room was beautiful, lit by enormous chandeliers, waiters circulating with trays of champagne, and conversations lingering in every direction. Emily looked stunning. He stared at her for long seconds and thought about how lucky he still felt to be with her. She smiled, but her eyes were distracted, scanning the room. And it was there that something in him began to slowly and silently crumble. Amidst smiles, greetings, and raised glasses, he began to realize he was merely a companion that night. That her eyes sought another center, another validation. That the glow was no longer for him. But even so, he remained by her side. He smiled. He feigned comfort. He chatted with strangers. And inside, he was fighting a suffocating feeling of being a stranger in his own story. What he didn't know was that night wouldn't be just another event. It would be the point where everything would change. The line that separates before from after. And when the tango began to play in the back of the room, his eyes met hers, and there, wordlessly, everything had already been said. The hall was filled with lights and voices, but to Noah, the sound seemed distant, muffled, as if underwater. He watched Emily from afar, her red dress contrasting with the golden walls, her hair carefully tied in a bun that exposed her neck, delicate and vulnerable. She seemed part of a world that no longer included him. He tried to convince himself it was just an impression, that fatigue and routine were turning him into a suspicious man, but the truth had been knocking at his door for some time, and he simply pretended not to hear. When the tango began, the first bandoneon chord cut through the air like a blade. Emily turned and, smiling, asked if she could dance with her boss. The request was simple, but the silence that followed made the air heavy. Noah took a deep breath and replied in the strongest voice he could muster, even as his heart broke, "Yes, but after that, we'll go back alone to different houses." Words fell to the hall floor like broken glasses. No one moved. The eyes turned to them, and Emily stood still for a few seconds, the smile still frozen on her face, before composing herself with a veneer of elegance. But inside her, something shattered. Inside him, everything was over. He left without looking back. The tango music continued as he crossed the room, leaving behind not just one night, but a lifetime built on love and patience. In the car, his hands trembled on the steering wheel. Anger and sadness mingled with a sense of relief. For the first time, he had stood up for himself. For the first time, he had set boundaries. In the days that followed, the silence between them became deafening. Emily tried to talk, but he was tired of hearing empty promises and feeling like love had become a formality. So he packed his bags and left the apartment. The separation was civilized, without shouting, without scenes, just the emptiness left by two bodies that no longer belonged together. She stayed. He went. And the world moved on, as it always does when people stop walking together. Months later, time had healed the most exposed wounds, but what hurt was still invisible. Noah began to rebuild his life little by little. He changed neighborhoods, his routines, his clothes. He ran through the mornings, hanging out with friends he hadn't seen in a long time, laughing without guilt. Until he met someone. A beautiful coincidence, like all coincidences that change the course of a story. Her name was Claire. She had a calm gaze and a light-hearted way of being, without needing to embellish anything. With her, Noah didn't feel the need to prove he was enough, didn't need to be strong all the time. It was a calm, breathable relationship, of discreet complicity. They met in cafes, exchanged confidences, talked about the past without resentment. Claire didn't want to heal his wounds, just be present while time did the work that interrupted love couldn't complete. Little by little, Noah began to feel that life had pulsed with color again. Meanwhile, Emily sank into silence. The professional success that had once seemed the center of everything lost its luster. The applause died down, and the echo of emptiness became deafening. She tried to fill her evenings with appointments, but the apartment that had once been filled with voices and laughter now echoed with the sound of her own footsteps. One afternoon, while tidying a drawer, she found a photo of the two of them. They were smiling on a weekend trip, embraced by a lake. Noah's gaze on her was one of pure love, and it struck her like a dagger. Regret arrived not as a sudden blow, but as a rising tide that engulfed everything. She realized that, in seeking admiration, she had lost the one who truly loved her. Pride prevented her from seeking him for a time. But pride, when faced with loneliness, crumbles. She decided to call. Her trembling voice broke the silence on the other end of the line. He answered. It was a short, polite conversation, but she insisted on meeting in person. When she saw him again, her heart sank. He looked different, lighter, with a serene gleam in his eyes. They sat on a park bench, like two old acquaintances. She apologized. She said everything she needed to, without masks, without excuses. She said she had made a mistake, that she had lost herself, that she believed she was being left aside when, in fact, it was she who was distancing herself. He listened to her in silence. And when she finished, she expected to hear something from him, anything. A gesture, a promise, a spark of what they once were. But he merely took a deep breath and responded calmly. He said he forgave her, because forgiveness was the only way to stop carrying that pain. He said there was no more anger, but there was also no more love. He said he was fine, and that he had found peace. She tried to smile, but her teary eyes betrayed her. She asked if there was anyone. He said yes. That there was someone who made him feel alive again. And in that moment, Emily understood that their story was truly over. In the days that followed, she tried to convince herself that it was necessary, that time would erase what was left. But regret doesn't fade. It settles in. She began to relive every moment, every choice, every small, ignored sign. And then came the final blow. One ordinary afternoon, she decided to go out for coffee at the same place she used to go with Noah. She walked in, ordered the same cappuccino, and sat at the same table. The familiar aroma brought a strange sensation, as if she were inside a memory. She looked at the door and froze. Noah was there. Holding hands with Claire. They laughed, talked, shared the same space that had once belonged to them. Emily didn't know whether to stand, hide, or smile. She remained motionless. She watched as he leaned over and brushed a strand of hair from Claire's face, the same gesture he made with her. A small gesture, but full of meaning. It was in that moment that the truth dawned on her like a sentence: he had moved on. Not only did she follow, but she found in another person everything she once had and let slip away. The coffee in her mouth turned bitter. Her hands trembled. The noise around her faded. The world, for a few seconds, stopped. When he finally saw her, the smile on his face faded for a moment, but there was no discomfort, just a calm, almost gentle look. Claire, unsure of who she was, smiled politely. Emily simply waved back shyly and looked away. That was the first and last time they crossed paths after all. As she left the cafe, the cold air hit her face, and she realized she was crying. Not an explosive cry, but a silent one, the kind that comes from within, born from the recognition of a definitive loss. And as she walked the streets, she understood that there was no greater punishment than witnessing, with her own eyes, the happiness she had destroyed with her own hands. Later, at home, she looked in the mirror and almost didn't recognize herself. It wasn't her face aged by time, but her gaze deliberately hollowed out. She grabbed her phone, opened her old photos, and there they were, laughing, dreaming, believing. Each image was a reminder of who she had been alongside a man who loved her without reservation. And now, all that remained was the cruel certainty that love never returns, no matter how much regret screams. She turned on the music that had played at that party, the tango she never danced, and let the sound fill the empty house. She danced alone, imagining what it would be like if she had made different choices. The reflection in the mirror showed a woman alone, toiling among ghosts, searching in every movement for the echo of a love that no longer exists. Across town, Noah was thinking too. Not of sadness, but of acceptance. He knew he'd had to go through all of that to understand his own worth. That love, to exist, requires reciprocity, not resistance. As he walked with Claire down the sidewalk, he felt the world regain its color, the weight of the previous years finally lifting. She held his hand, and he smiled, a light smile, without guilt, without the past. The wind blew cold, but within him there was calm. The wound had become a scar. And in the silence of the night, as the world moved on, two hearts beat at different times, one beginning anew, the other learning to live with the echo of all it had lost. Fate, sometimes, doesn't need revenge. It simply shows, with the same gentleness with which it destroys, that love cannot survive indifference. And for Emily, the greatest punishment wasn't loneliness, but the exact moment she saw, with her own eyes, what happiness was, and knew it would never be hers again. The months passed like an autumn refusing to yield to winter. Each falling leaf seemed to symbolize another piece of everything left behind. Noah, now in a different phase of life, carried a serenity that came not from the absence of pain, but from the acceptance of what he could not control. His relationship with Claire had matured over time. It was no longer just a breeze of new beginnings, but a solid partnership, built on presence, respect, and genuine love. There were no comparisons, no demands. She never tried to take anyone's place, simply filled her own, with care and patience. And little by little, Noah began to look to the future with less weary eyes. The days were light, the silences comfortable, the plans real. Claire taught him that loving again wasn't betraying the past, it was honoring one's own capacity for rebuilding. Emily, on the other hand, was immersed in a silent path of loss that time wouldn't erase. Work continued, commitments continued, but everything now felt mechanical. She had become a spectator to her own life. On the outside, there were still those who saw her as an admirable woman. But on the inside, she knew she had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. It wasn't just Noah's absence, but her own absence. She tried to move on a few times, but the relationships crumbled before they even began. No one stayed. No one deepened. As if every man who crossed her path carried, even without knowing it, the shadow of what she lost. There were nights when she wished she could go back in time, break up the party, decline the invitation to dance, say yes to love and no to her ego. But life doesn't offer that kind of return. It offers lessons. And it exacts a heavy price for each one. One day, Emily learned from a mutual friend that Noah and Claire were engaged. The news came like a cold blade, cutting through the little hope that still lingered. But it wasn't jealousy, it wasn't heartbreak. It was the definitive realization that there was no way back. She decided not to attend the wedding, even though she knew, on some level, she would be welcomed. She chose not to expose herself to the pain of seeing with her own eyes what she had destroyed. Instead, she spent the day alone. She deleted her social media, turned off her phone, and sat on the porch, staring at the gray sky as if waiting for something to change on the outside when everything was already in ruins on the inside. That afternoon, she wrote a letter to herself. Not to send it, not to apologize to anyone, but to remember who she was. And how, without realizing it, she had killed the truest love she had ever known. Noah and Claire's wedding was intimate, simple, and meaningful. There was no ostentation, just truth. He looked at her at the altar with the same eyes he once had for another woman, but now there was maturity there, a look that had already known pain and, therefore, valued peace even more. During their vows, he spoke of the importance of being chosen not only when everything is good, but especially when everything is difficult. Claire cried, holding his hand tightly, as if to say she would never let go. The reception was marked by sincere hugs, calm smiles, and soft music. Nothing overdone. Just what was necessary to celebrate the essential, a love rebuilt on the courage to move forward. In the following months, life took the natural course it does when there's harmony. Noah and Claire bought a small house with a front yard and space to plant something together. The dog he and Emily never adopted now existed, a lazy Labrador retriever Claire found at a shelter and who became part of their new family. In the late afternoons, they sat on the porch, drinking tea, and talking about everything and nothing. It wasn't the kind of love that explodes, but the kind that endures. And sometimes that's what matters most. Noah didn't forget the past, but he wasn't trapped in it. He carried the story like someone carrying a scar, visible, but painless. Emily, for her part, decided to go to therapy. Not to understand Noah, but to understand herself. She began to look inward more honestly, confronting her own fears, insecurities, and vanities. She discovered that betrayal doesn't begin with a kiss, but with the moment you stop appreciating what you have. She realized her mistake wasn't wanting to be seen, but forgetting the person who admired her every day. In one of the sessions, she confessed to the therapist that her biggest regret wasn't the end of her marriage, but the way she treated the person who loved her most. She said she could have spoken up, asked for help, and exposed her confusion, but she chose silence. And silence is a slow but fatal poison. Years later, they crossed paths one last time. Noah and Claire were walking with their young son in a park. Emily was sitting on a bench, reading a book. Their eyes met for a few seconds. He smiled slightly, and she returned it with a discreet nod. There was no resentment, no pain. Just the acceptance that, at some point in their lives, they had been everything to each other. And then, they became strangers with shared memories. When he walked away, she closed the book and stared up at the sky. For the first time, she felt that perhaps she, too, deserved to start over. But now, with truth. With humility. And with the knowledge that love, when left untended, doesn't die suddenly, it dies slowly, until one day, it simply ceases to exist. And so ends the story of two who loved each other deeply, but lost each other through choices they didn't make together. One started over. The other learned. And life, merciless and fair, moved on, as it always does. Comment below what you thought of this story. Which part moved you most? Do you believe love can be rebuilt after pain like this? Or that some losses teach more than 1,000 victories? If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos. Here, each story is designed to touch your heart and leave a message for life. And speaking of messages, here's the most important one: betrayal destroys it breaks bonds, dissolves promises, and tears apart homes that took years to build. It may seem gentle, silent, even justifiable, but the damage it causes is profound, often irreversible. That's why this channel does not support, does not encourage and does not normalize no kind of betrayal. The choice to cheat is always a choice against love. And once lost, love doesn't always come back. Until the next story.